Hey everyone, welcome back after almost 2 months of not doing the Oh My Curry Goodness podcast. It's been a long time since I last did it or did an episode, or at least last time I published an episode, but I'm excited to finally start doing the Oh My Curry Goodness podcast and continuing to learn from incredible Gen Zers. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow the podcast on Instagram at the OMCG podcast. And I know as much as I love interviewing people from different industries, particularly the Gen Z generation, I wanted to actually use this time to talk about why I decided to take a almost 2 month break. And I say almost 2 months because technically I was supposed to take a break starting in May, but then there was one episode I didn't publish. It was the one with Marcus Knight, my last guest before the break, and I actually published it on the first Thursday of May. So that's why I say almost 2 months. And then also, I intend to release this episode on the last Thursday of June. So don't know if that's 2 months, but I'm just gonna say it is. So I decided to take a 2 month break and I wanted to break it down into two parts. The first part was what I could control, and the second part, which is more in quantity, the things that I couldn't control that I hope to change in future episodes. So the reason why I decided to take a break was if you've been following the podcast, you will, if you've been listening to every episode, thank you so much. It means a lot. But I also understand if you started following after a specific period of time, in 20, if you were to look back at when I published interviews in 2023, the episode title was the name of the guest, and then the episode description was just a little brief description about what to expect on the podcast. And at the time, I thought it was a great idea because some of the podcasts that I've listened to, they that's what they do. They have a little description and the name of the guest. And it took me a long time to realize that that is not the right fit for me, especially given that because no one knows who I am, it's hard to want to be interested. I feel like based on my perception, maybe I'm overthinking, but you guys probably know that if you've been following the podcast that I overthink a lot. But I realized that there needs to be a different way of presenting the podcast because I think it's easy to get away with the name of the episode being the name of the guest if people know who you are. But because people don't know me, it's gonna be difficult to get people to listen. So I, as of this recording, have not changed every episode, but there are still a lot of episodes that are updated, particularly in 2023. So a lot of the episode titles are just the name of the guest. For example, the first episode of the podcast is Julian Pavoni. Now I changed it to something else. I just don't know off the top of my head. But if you were to check the episodes out, you'll get an idea and you'll see that there are a lot of it's not just the name of the guest, it's the name of the guest and then a little bit of who they are because my podcast centers around the idea of storytelling and then each episode description is more descriptive in the sense that you get to know a little bit of a background on who the guest is and then bullet points that indicate or that talk about what was discussed on the podcast. And then there are links in order to get in touch with the appropriate guest. Like I said, I haven't done it with all of my episodes as of this recording, but I've done it with some. And I hope that by the time this episode comes out, which would be the last Thursday of June, that I'm either almost done or I'm close. Or no, sorry, they're the same thing. I'm almost done or done. So I wanted to come up with new episode titles and descriptions so that there's more understanding of what to expect in the episode, background on the guest, and then also in a way because I still am trying to promote the podcast or trying to find ways to promote the podcast because it has been a challenge throughout the past year and a half. I think it looks it there's a element of presentability. It looks more clean, for lack of a better phrase. So I hope that, and the thing is, I don't just come up with these episode titles. Well, I do, but I don't just put them on based on how I feel. I check with the guest and I say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of in terms of episode titles and descriptions. Please let me know if they work because I want to make sure that people have an idea as to what to expect. And also, it just looks much nicer and more clear as opposed to the name of the guest. And you have probably a million questions as to where the podcast will go. And then, secondly, a better understanding of who the guest is because you probably don't know every guest that's on the podcast. I wish I knew that earlier on, but I'm glad that I'm making these changes because let's be honest, no one knows who I am, so I can't just get away with episode title and then a small introduction as to, or a small description as to who the guest is. So I hope you guys like the new titles and descriptions, and I can always change them if needed or if I'm overthinking again. But every guest I've reached out to said they like the new they like the new episode titles and descriptions, so it's a good start. So that is the what I can control. I can't control the conversations. I can't control the questions I've asked because that's already in the past, but I could at least control the new titles and descriptions. So I decided to do that. And quite honestly, it looks much better. There's a better understanding. Of course, I know people don't know who I am, but I hope to share my story and continue to promote my podcast and promote myself in the future so that more people can check out the podcast that centers around the importance of storytelling and understanding a person's experiences because that's what I've been passionate about. And why I stuttered there is actually the next thing I want to talk about, which is the things that I can't control. I cannot control what happened in the past, but after watching or I think there are 65 episodes published, and I can't change those title episodes in terms, I can't change the conversation of the questions, but I realized that the podcast was in some sort of identity crisis. If you were to ask me why I created the podcast, it's to learn about a human being's story, especially among Gen Zers. I want to focus on the Gen Z generation because we don't usually have the space to talk about the personal experiences. I say that we focus on the who we are instead of the what they are because we talk to people based on the work that they're doing, but I want to focus and highlight the human being behind the guest and talk about the good and bad experiences. But there were times where, and I'm not going to name a specific episode because I just feel that's inappropriate, but there were quite a number of episodes where the episode, it felt like the podcast was more of like a self-help podcast where I was talking about your mindset, the tools you need, the insightful advice that guests have brought. And there's a problem. Here's my problem with self-help podcasts. Well, believe it or not, there's nothing wrong with it, but here's why I didn't like that. The first thing is because a lot of the things that I've talked about, like proving people wrong, the idea of growth, the idea of making mistakes, being limitless, not caring what other people think, these these issues exist. However, I have not been a master of it. I still worry about the small things. And so who am I to tell people about about the tools they need? Because I'm not a self-help guy. I'm not a self-help guru. I mean, the best people to maybe reach out, maybe listen to would probably be Jay Shetty, Lewis House, Stephen Bartlett. They may be better podcasters when it comes to self-help. I am more focused on the storytelling. And I think there was a time, especially late 2023 and maybe early 2024, which it was like, you don't know what this podcast was about. And so I wanted to focus on making sure I steer the podcast ship into the right direction, which is focusing on the person's story. Now, I will admit that self-help, maybe self-help is a good avenue to go to. And maybe at some point with this podcast, I might visit it. But at the time, I still want to start at a specific place and I want to start focusing on the storytelling phase. And then at some point, maybe next year or whenever, I might want to revisit the idea of self-help because they kind of go together, self-help and storytelling. But I want to focus on that because that's the why behind I created the podcast. And I want to focus on that as much as possible. I also feel that storytelling, and maybe I'll be wrong on this, but I'm willing to learn and I can always correct myself. But I feel like storytelling often stems from I think storytelling allows you to try and understand people because it's not about what's right or what's wrong, it's what they went through and what they did at the time, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But you can try to at least understand why they did it because that's what they were going through, or maybe they were going through certain things that we don't go through. And the thing about storytelling is that no two human beings are the same. We may have similarities, but we have a lot of differences. But despite those differences, can we try to find the similarities with each guest? And so I wanted to go back to the storytelling phase, and I've already started recording episodes that I plan on releasing in July. And already I have done a good job, if you will, of in staying in my lane, if you will, staying into the storytelling lane instead of going into, okay, let's talk about the tools or the growth, because that's just not, I'm not an expert in that. And I think the second part, and I feel like I went on a tangent. The second part, interestingly enough, is I didn't recognize who the host of the podcast was. And watching these past, okay, I think I just said I watched every episode. I need to check, I need to correct myself. Another thing I want to talk about as to why I took a break. I've listened to a lot of the episodes. There are still a few episodes I've yet to listen to, but I've noticed that there were times where it was unbearable to listen to myself, not because I hate the sound of my voice, even though I say that quite often. It's because the things that I was saying, I was asking myself, why did I say that? That's not who I am. And when I talked about the idea of growth or proving people wrong, or I guess any other self-help topic, that's not who I am. So because I'm not an expert, now I'm acting as if I know things that I don't know. And now what made it wasn't just the horrible voice, the hate that's out of my voice that made it unbearable to listen to, or maybe the bad questions, because I'm very hard on myself, but also the fact that I played a character that I know for a fact wasn't me. And so the podcast identity crisis in its entirety stemmed from that's why, or let me take that back. That's why I talked about podcast identity crisis, because there was a time where I didn't know who I was, I didn't know my goals for this podcast, and it felt like the podcast itself didn't have a clear direction. And so I want to, going forward, and I want to talk about this later on, focus on the storytelling phase as much as possible and only talk about self-help topics if it's absolutely needed. One of the things that I've been trying to do is every question that I've asked each guest, and I've had a couple of interviews, is to remember to go back to the guest. Every question needs to be about the guest. Everything, whatever they say, however the guest responds, and then, oh, actually, how do I word this? And then whenever they give their answers, how do I respond based on the personal aspect as opposed to maybe talking about self-help in any way. With nothing wrong about it, but I can't talk about things that I don't know much about. So I want to focus on that going forward. So with podcast identity crisis leads to confidence. And so I want to break confidence down into two parts. The first part is pretty obvious. When you don't know much, it's very easy to feel like it's when you don't know much, it's easy to talk down on yourself. There were times where looking back, I because I was so confused as to what the podcast was about, I thought the best answer would be to quit. The only reason why I didn't quit the podcast is because I still love learning about people's stories and I didn't want to quit again because I don't know if you guys, if any of you have known, I don't know how much you guys know about me, but Oh My Curry Goodness is the fourth podcast I created. Previously, I started one and quit, and then I quit. Started one, then quit. Started one, then quit. So now I started Oh My Curry Goodness. I didn't want to just quit. I thought it'd be nice to take a break, and so then I could refocus on the why as to why, or the why as to the the starting of Oh My Curry Goodness, or creating Oh My Curry Goodness. And now that I've taken a 2 month break, I am in a better state of mind in terms of, okay, this is what I want out of each guest. These are the conversations I want to have. And I want to focus as much as possible on the storytelling phase, because especially I'm still very early on in the podcast. Even though I'm in a year and a half, I want to make sure that it's consistent. You know exactly what to expect, but by having self-help and storytelling, it provides inconsistency, and with inconsistency can lead to confidence or a loss of confidence. And that was something that I felt, especially with the last few episodes. So I wanted to take a break and just recharge myself. And then once I am comfortable with doing episodes again, I and then at some point I will then start doing podcast episodes, because I come to the point where I know where I went wrong, and here is what I'm gonna do to make sure that I don't fall into these issues. So I guess the podcast identity crisis, not knowing what the podcast is about, led me to a loss of confidence. The other part of confidence, which I know I've said this so many times, but I still want to say it because it's true, is that maybe the conversations I was having, the questions I was asking, maybe weren't good enough, which is weird because every guest I've had will say that the conversation was good, the conversations were good. Some of my friends who listen to the podcast say that the podcast is good and that I'm being too hard on myself. Now, I do appreciate that, because I do question whether I am a great interviewer, or I don't want to say great, a good interviewer, but still, I still feel that some of the questions I asked were not good enough. And I've noticed that I kept asking the same type of questions over and over again. And while they may be good questions, I want to make sure that they're different, because every guest is different, every experience is different, and but just by asking the same questions over and over again, it kind of makes it boring. And I realized I did a lot of that. So I want to limit the amount of repetitive questions as much as possible. And there would be times where I would leave a podcast interview feeling like the conversations were good. Maybe I messed up, which, to be honest, if you ask me, is a lot of times. And so that's another thing, I guess, the recharge, not just focusing on, okay, what does the podcast about? What is the podcast about? But also taking the time to learn from other podcasters, some of whom I've actually had on my podcast, and just learn about how they converse with people, and what are the questions they ask, and how do they have conversations. Because that's what podcasting is about, is having conversations, especially when you're learning about people's stories. It's about learning about their experiences, what they've learned. And I want to make sure that I go back into it knowing that I will feel more confident, and I will give myself more grace if I have bad interviews. Now, again, this could be my negative self taking over this portion of this podcast update. But and I'm sure people will say, Hamza, your podcast, the conversations you have are good. But even then, I often feel like there's always ways to improve. There's always ways to be a better interviewer. And so I'm going to continue to learn from some of the podcasts I've listened to, whether I've had them on the podcast, or like the podcast I mentioned previously or prior to, or some of the podcasts I mentioned a few minutes ago, like Jay Shetty, Stephen Bartlett, Lewis House. They're great interviewers that combine questions and having conversations. One of the things I mentioned is I don't want to just make it a Q&A, in the sense I don't want to just make it be a question, answer, move on to the next question. It's more like question, answer, and then let's talk about the answer, so we could have these really unique conversations. So I wanted to focus on my confidence level, because there was a time where I just didn't feel like I was a great interviewer, and I wanted to rewatch the tapes, go back to the gym, hypothetically speaking. And like I said, I've already done a few episodes. So right now, if you were to ask me how they went, I think I feel much better now as an interviewer than prior, just because of the fact that I'm staying true to the why behind the podcast, and also because the guests are enjoying the conversations, and I I don't want to say I didn't enjoy the previous 65 episodes or interviews, but it's like I feel much better. Like these are the conversations I'd like to have, and these are the types of questions I'd like to have. And because of how good they were, I want to continue doing that going forward. So the confidence level, and I know that's not going to be, and I'm at peace at knowing that not every episode is going to be the best from an interviewer performance, but can I at least have a consistent performance? I know I sound like an athlete. Podcasting is not a sport, but at the same time, I still want to develop that consistency so people know what to expect. And I hope that the you listen to the episodes and you have a sense of an oh my curry goodness moment where you're like, wow, these are interesting conversations. These aren't what I've seen before. I want my podcast to be different. And so I want to be confident going forward, and I want to be confident in what I publish. So there's the pre-podcast, which is before the guest. Then there's the during the podcast, which is with the guest, and then after the podcast. And I want to make sure that I feel confident in every stage: the pre-podcast, the current podcast, and then the post-podcast. So confidence is going to be important, and I've already felt much better about the conversations. And I want to be really clear: when I say it's a bad interview, it's never the fault of the guest. It's more of the fault of me. And there's a saying, I forget where it comes from, but great answers come from great questions. And I'm sure everyone who's listening to this who has a podcast knows that there is a responsibility of the interviewer or the host of the podcast to make sure that they ask thought-provoking questions to a guest. You want the guest to think. That's another thing I want to note, is that I want the guest to think about the conversations as opposed to just coming up with an answer, because then I feel like the question was bad. But again, maybe I'm overthinking this, but then again, I want to be different from every podcast, or I want to be different from other podcasters in terms of the conversations and the questions that are discussed on Oh My Curry Goodness. The last part of the I cannot control that I want to start doing better at is the messaging and contradictions. What I mean by that, and this kind of ties into the podcast identity crisis reason, which is there were parts again where I was saying things that I know I don't know too much of. I don't know much about self-help, and yet I was talking about self-help. And so that's why I say it made it unbearable, because there were so many things that I said that it was confusing. Like, why am I saying this? Because I don't know much about it. And I think what's interesting is I talk about the idea of gratefulness, and I know I'm not making it sound like podcasting was a deeply difficult experience, but because of my lack of knowledge when it comes to self-help, it led me to learning more about different self-help issues, or different areas where people will need self-help or personal development, such as not caring about what other people think. I mean, like I said, I still worry about that, right? And so I wanted to focus on educating myself on these topics so that I might have a better understanding. And even though I want to stay away from these topics because it's a storytelling podcast, at least when we do talk about self-help topics, that I'm in a much better place, or a much better situation or position to talk about it. Maybe not an expert, but at least a basic understanding, if you will. Now, the contradictory part is interesting, because what I mean by that is there were times where on one episode, I will say one thing, but then in another episode, I will say something that is the opposite of what I said in another episode. So for example, if you don't know me, I totally understand, but the best way to learn more about me is, I think the last episode of 2023, or season 1, I decided to do an episode about me. I know it's weird. I should have made this my first episode, but I didn't know too much. And I wish I knew more, but at the time I was too excited about interviewing guests that I forgot to share my own story. So if you want to go check out my interview. It's just look up Hamza Islam and I'm right there. You'll get to know more about me. And that podcast, so my friend Ben Rumi, who handles the audio part of the podcast, he was the host and I was the guest. And so I got to explain a little bit more about my story, and I hope to do more of it in the future, but that was just a basic, I guess, the first one where I was able to share my personal journey as to who I am and my podcasting journey. But what was interesting is I mentioned this before, but I am someone of South Asian descent. Specifically, my parents come from Bangladesh, which is a country in South Asia, and I still have to tell people that it's a country and it's an actual country, not a city in India, or it's not India. It's not another name for India. And we were talking about South Asian identity, and the thing I said was, again, I remembered I talked about how I do worry about what other people think. And I said, I don't live in fear, but I do try my best to make my parents proud, because in the South Asian community that I am a part of, is that we do like to compare kids to others. I don't know why we do that, but we do. And I've come to learn that other cultures do it. And I think it can be scary at times, because it's like, I hope my parents have something to quote unquote brag about. The reason why I bring that example was I did an interview with Joseph and Monica Blanco. It was the first time I interviewed two people at once and their siblings. And we were talking, and Joseph asked me about my South Asian identity. And on that interview, I said I was living in fear. And so on one episode, I was saying I was living in fear. And another episode, I was saying I was not living in fear. And looking back, I realized I should have changed it, because it's not that I'm living in fear. And I wish I could take that back, because it makes it sound as if I'm painting my South Asian or Bengali community as evil. They're not evil, they're just annoying. Well, some of them are annoying, but most people, no, some of them are 50-50. Some of them are annoying, but there are some good people. But I think what I was trying to say was I worry too much about what others think, and I think I use an extreme way of explaining it, and I realized that's not the best way of saying it. So I want to be careful with what I say and be more intentional, because I don't want to paint any community wrongly, and more importantly, so that I don't have contradictory messages. No one has actually told me about this, so I'm thankful in a way, but I'm glad that I'm able to address these, just in case people start listening and then they go, wait a minute, what's going on here? Other examples of contradictory messages include, there are times where one guest, I'll say it's about proving people wrong. Another guest will be proving people right. And this one's a 50-50. You can either go both ways, but I guess the reason why I said this is maybe out of nervousness, because I think there were times where I didn't know, maybe I was nervous and I was just talking way more than I needed to, and I just wanted to steer the ship in the right direction, and I wanted to do that by making sure the guest nods to what I say. And also because some guests have a perspective, like some people believe in proving people wrong, some people believe in proving themselves right. So I guess it depends on people's perspective, but I want to make sure that I limit, or better, eliminate as many contradictory messages or bad messaging as possible. Because one, I want to make sure that even if you guys don't know who I am, I want to make sure that I know who the host is, and not go in a situation where even I go, who is the host of this podcast? And then more importantly, I don't want to be confusing and share conflicting messages. If you want to know the right answer as to whether I'm living in fear of the South Asian community or the Bengali community, or not living in fear, the best place to go is the episode on me. And it's the last episode of 2023. So with all that being said, what are some changes I'm making to the podcast? Well, it's going to be the same thing as you've seen from the first episode back in January of 2023 to the last episode I published, which is technically May, like the first Thursday of May. These conversations are going to be the same. The only difference is more personal changes. So being more calm, being more present, being more, having more thoughtful conversations, just because it felt like maybe the questions or the conversations I was having weren't good enough. But hopefully I will make more sense, and I hope that I know who I am, and I know that, or I know who I am after every interview. Again, this may not be something that you will notice, but I hope that you can still see that there's a slight difference in terms of how I talk to each guest. Because again, I don't want to be known as that self-help person. I don't want the podcast to be a self-help podcast. I just want to be a podcast where it's about learning about people's perspectives and their experiences. So these changes may not be, like I said, they may not be noticeable, at least a huge notice, but there is a small notice in terms of where the conversations go, and just trying to be more calm and present so that hopefully not just the guest understands what I'm talking about, but also you as the listener. Now, there are a few changes I want to make to the podcast. Well, this will actually take place next year. So I intend to make the last episode of season two on the last Thursday of November. I don't know the calendar dates, but the last Thursday of November will be the last episode of season two. And the start of season three, usually I start, I mean, obviously, if you can tell, season one, season two started in January. Season three of Oh My Curry Goodness will start in April. The reason why I'm doing that is a couple of things. The first reason is because I'm actually taking a fifth year at Ohio State, and so I'm going to prioritize college classes so that I will be able to graduate. And balancing podcasting classes will be difficult in terms of preparation for the interviews and then just doing the interviews themselves, because it can be difficult once you're in college classes to balance your passions and your other personal side projects. So I want to focus more on graduation, or or I want to focus more on getting ready for graduation. Fingers crossed that I don't fail any classes, but just getting to the finish line. And I feel like the best way to get to the finish line is to put some other things to the side. And then the second part is I want to promote the podcast more. So I hope to work with different student organizations across Ohio State and maybe in the city of Columbus that focus a lot on storytelling. So I want to be able to focus on the promotion part, because the podcast has had I've had trouble trying to promote the podcast. And while I don't want to just get views because I just want to understand people's stories, I believe the podcast is really unique, and it's that you're able to understand human beings in a unique way. And I think the best way to share that message is, of course, to reach out to different organizations. So with that being said, these are the changes I'm making. Obviously, it's still a few months before college starts, or Ohio State. I think Ohio State starts sometime in mid-August. So there are some changes I want to make because I want to continue to promote the podcast and promote myself, because again, it's a great idea, but I feel like we're a sleeping giant and we're just going to need to reach out to as many people as possible. And there's going to be people that, I'm sure there are going to be people that will not promote the podcast or support it, but I also know that there are a group of people that will support this podcast. It's just that they haven't heard about it. So I can't wait to see what's to come in the future. And with this podcast, hopefully a lot of people listen to it and continue sharing that message of having an open mind, because regardless of the successes people have, that there's still other things that we don't know that they probably would want to talk about, because and the highlight reels make up 1% of the person, but the 99%, what's behind closed doors, that's the human experience. Also, another message I didn't like on the podcast was when I said, regardless of who you are capable of doing great things. The problem is that there's so many people that may have had that mindset, and yet they haven't been able to accomplish what they wanted to do. And so I want to be really careful when I talk about you're going to find the light at the end of the tunnel, because the truth, to be completely honest, there are a lot of people that haven't found that light at the end of the tunnel. There was actually a conversation I learned from, I actually learned that from a conversation I had with Zane Landon back in 2023 or season one. So I want to be more careful with what I say and just focus on what I know and what I'm curious about, which is learning about people's stories. And I don't like, and to be honest, my story is not even that interesting in the sense that I didn't create a company or anything or part of some sort of organization. So the idea of saying you are capable of doing great things regardless of who you are just doesn't sit right with me. But again, I'm probably overthinking it. So I don't know. It's up to you guys. It's up to you as to whether I'm overthinking or not. But with that being said, that leads me to the end of the podcast update. I wanted to, after taking a 2 month break, I thought it would be best to restart the podcast, if you will, by talking about what I've done during the past 2 months and why I decided to take a break. And so I hope you guys are able to, I hope I addressed as many concerns or issues as possible. And if I'm overthinking, I apologize. You know, that's something I do quite often, but I will assure you, I will promise you, I'm going to work on it because at some point I got to get out of that situation and just not overthink, which I know is hard, but I'm sure it's going to be a process. So thank you guys so much for checking this podcast update out. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow the podcast on Instagram, and this is a place where we will announce guests for each month, and you'll also see podcast clips and other announcements. So thank you guys so much for checking this episode out, and I hope to see you guys in the next episode. And I don't know when I will be releasing the list of guests that will be on the podcast for the month of July. Obviously, it'd probably be closer. Uh, well, it's probably gonna be closer to July. I don't know if it's after I release this episode or before this episode. And like I said, I plan to release this podcast update on the last Thursday of June. So I don't know if it's going to be before that or after that, but it will be there. And I hope that you continue to learn from incredible Gen Zers. And if you want, you can always check back and start from the first episode of the podcast and then binge listen or binge watch until the latest episode, wherever that is. But I hope you guys continue to support this podcast. It's fun learning from Gen Zers from around the world. And yeah, that's all I want to say. So thank you guys so much, even though I just said that for the third time. And take care.